Verstappen won a record-breaking 14th race of the season, defeating the challenge of Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. Coming up on the Grand Prix-Cap today, Red Bull took a risk and it paid off. The old Daniel Ricciardo was back, but will it last? I ask if Fernando Alonso is right to be furious with Alpine. And there's the race and driver ratings. So it's mics on and away we go. Well, welcome back everybody, and Max Verstappen won the race, and that's the end of the show. No, I'm just messing around. There was a little bit more than just Max Verstappen winning the Mexico City Grand Prix. He did drive a beautiful race, and we had Daniel Ricciardo fighting through. We had Fernando Alonso being upset with pretty much everybody who has a reliable engine and world championships. We're going to go through the driver ratings. And we're going to rate the race. We're going to try to rate it anyway. So let's just crack on, because Red Bull, they played a bit of a risky game. And it paid off, because they started on the softs. They gambled that the mediums would last to the end, having nursed the softs a little bit further than Pirelli kind of expected for an optimal one-stop. And I feel like they did just enough to wrong foot Mercedes, because I think Mercedes would have expected Perez to start on the soft tyres, but they would probably have expected Verstappen to be on the mediums. But the fact that he was on the softs and then was able to edge them out to sort of lap 22, 23-ish might have just sort of thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. And they would have had to think on the fly. But of course, this is Mercedes. They didn't win 8 Constructors' World Championships in a row by accident. And Mercedes switched to that unfancied hard tyre, which I think, again, the fact that Red Bull were on the mediums longer and Mercedes themselves were experiencing that drop-off made them feel like that was the way to go. But the thing is, the Mercedes W13 just doesn't have the inherent pace advantage to really make either strategy work for me. I think Red Bull were always in the pound seat because, first of all, they had pole position, and once they had held on to that with Max Verstappen at the first corner, they could run the race at their pace and make sure Mercedes didn't really get close enough. Because if it was roles reversed and Mercedes were on the softs, they might have pulled the undercut, and that might have worried Red Bull a little bit more. But as it was, Red Bull always had the strong position, and once they were in the lead, they could manage their tyres and preserve them. Basically, they ran, a race according to the computer, sort of. And especially once they were on the mediums and Verstappen had that 9-second lead after the stops, he didn't need to go flat out. He just had to manage the pace, knowing that he had the inherent car performance to open up the gap if Lewis got closer. Obviously, if the tyre started to fall apart, that would have been a problem. But they could have mitigated that by just switching early to a second set of mediums or another set of softs and kind of snookering Mercedes that way. But I think what also played into Red Bull's hands was the track surface lacking grip. It was so slippery because some of it had been re-tarmacked. And the mediums were just kind of in a window where they worked. And the soft tyres obviously didn't have the longevity and the pace to sustain that. But the mediums sort of ran like a dream, didn't they? If you managed them well enough, and Daniel Ricciardo showed this as well, if you managed them well, you'd get a lot of dividend from them. Mercedes, I feel like they weren't brave enough with their strategy. They could have ran a little bit longer and tried to go to the softs because, let's face it, Ferrari were out of the picture. Worst case scenario, they end up 3rd and 4th. So, and to a team like Mercedes, 3rd and 4th is, what's the point? They're in this game for victories. But Red Bull's strategy totally paid off. It wrong-footed Mercedes, and they thoroughly earned it. They deserved to win that race. And when we go to Mexico, we expect Red Bull to win. It's just one of those venues that Red Bull have become accustomed to winning at, and they did it again. Max Verstappen with an excellent drive. Now, there wasn't much of a battle at the front after the pit stops, but there was a bit of a ding-dong in the midfield, actually. We had the 2 Alpines and Lando Norris and Valtteri Bottas, and then Daniel Ricciardo joined in the fun. And this is the Daniel Ricciardo we hope to see when he joined McLaren, but it's just been, we all know the story, it's just not worked out. But Daniel Ricciardo kind of ran the strategy that could have won Mercedes the race. He went from mediums to softs. And we saw some excellent overtaking moves, not the one on Tsunoda, obviously, from Daniel Ricciardo, because it was just like having the old Daniel Rick back, wasn't it? It really, really was. It was such a refreshing moment to see the Australian surging past people, late on the brakes. Of course, DRS and his strategy was playing into that, but you still have to make the most of it. You know, how many times have we seen Ricciardo just at sea with the car setup and the balance and having absolutely no pace? Last weekend in Austin, it was awful. The guy looked close to tears in the interview pen post race, and you have to feel so sorry for him, because obviously within reason, because they're very well paid and they get to travel and do all of these things. But when you are that competitive, when you're born and bred really to be a winner, like all of these drivers are, having that constant failure can be really difficult, especially if they haven't come up against it earlier on in their career. And that resilience is really, really important. And that's what sets, maybe if you take Lewis Hamilton, he's had setbacks, none more hefty than last year, but 2016 with Nico Rosberg, 2007, he missed out on the title in his rookie season at the last race by a point. So he's had his setbacks and he's come back, he's shown that resilience. And other drivers have shown it too. And I feel that this was a day where Ricciardo showed what was really possible in that McLaren. And who knows how Oscar Piastri is going to fare next season. He's a rookie. It's a tricky car to drive. Even Lando Norris admits that. So that was the thing is, Daniel Ricciardo wasn't only fighting opposition. He wasn't just fighting the car this weekend. He was also fighting a 10-second time penalty for that collision with Tsunoda, which took the Japanese driver out of the race. For me, the 10 seconds was harsh. I feel it was handed out because Yuki failed to finish rather than the actual contact, which was minor. It wasn't a hugely damaging collision. In fact, there was damage to the side pod, of course, but when two cars come together like that, that's kind of to be expected, and that is obviously the reason why Tsunoda failed to finish. But we've seen other collisions like that only be punished with 5-second time penalties. Bit harsh from the FIA, I think, the stewards at least. I feel 5 seconds would have been sufficient, and incidents shouldn't be judged on their outcome. They should be judged on the event itself. So regardless of whether a driver is taken out of the race or not, you should look at what has happened and the events leading up to it, and then hand down the correct penalty. I'm not saying 10 seconds was wrong, I just feel it was a bit harsh. I feel that other drivers have been given a 5-second time penalty for very similar incidents, and that this one was kind of doubled because Tsunoda ended up out of the race. If you flip it back 7 days, George Russell made contact with Carlos Sainz, which ended Carlos Sainz's race, but the Mercedes driver only got 5 seconds. So again, we need consistency. We really, really do need consistency. Okay, so before we go into the driver ratings, I want to talk about Fernando Alonso. And he was a bit upset with the Alpine's reliability, but before the weekend, he got caught up in a bit of a storm around some comments he made about Lewis Hamilton and Lewis's World Championships. A bit of a shame, really, because Fernando is better than that. He tried to clarify and correct it on Twitter, but by then the cat was out of the bag. Shame, really, and really sad, because it just made him look really jealous. And Fernando's better than that. I don't think that's the way he wants to conduct himself, but I think sometimes his competitive nature kind of gets the better of him. And I'm going to upset a few Alonso fans here. I think he just has a chip on his shoulder when it comes to Lewis, because he's never got over the fact that he was beaten by a rookie at McLaren. And, it's just the way his career has panned out, and then you look at the way Lewis's career has panned out, it could easily be Fernando sitting there with 7 World Championships and not Lewis. But that's the sport we live in. Now, he was upset about the reliability, the Alpine conking out with a few laps to go. And there's this rhetoric that Fernando is going along with, that he's lost about 1,000 points this season. I mean, of course, he is the greatest driver ever to get in a car of any description. So why should we question him? So he's lost, this is by my rough calculations, he lost 8 points in Saudi Arabia to a failure to finish, possibly 4 points in Italy at Monza to breaking down there, 8 points in Singapore, and another 4 possibly in Mexico this weekend. So that's roughly 24-ish points lost to reliability. But he's also lost 10 points to post-race penalties in Miami and Canada. So you can't have it all your own way, Fernando. I mean, of course, there was the hydraulic failure in Australia, where he was on target for maybe 3rd on the grid, but we're not quite sure where he'd have finished in that race anyway. And the thing is, reliability is part and parcel of Formula One. Esteban Ocon drives exactly the same car. He's had reliability failures. So for Fernando to be throwing his toys out the pram there is not really constructive, I feel, because you can put it down to the fact that he's leaving, so he doesn't really care, but it does represent on him. And we of course, we saw how he reacted when he was in the McLaren Honda and the engine wasn't very good, the whole GP2 engine thing and everything else. So Fernando expects the best, which is fair enough, but to be saying those sort of things over the radio, it doesn't really help the people back at base at Enstone and in France where they're developing the power units. They're honest people doing the best they can, and for him to react like that, I think is disappointing. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that he was actually driving a really good race up to that point, and the reliability failure did hurt him and the team. Alright, it is time for some driver ratings. So, first of all, Red Bull and Max Verstappen started and finished first. A comfortable drive. I'm going to rate him as a 4 because he didn't have to do anything spectacular to win this race. He kind of won it at the start. Once he'd secured the lead, realistically, the Red Bull had the pace to beat the Mercedes on pretty much any strategy. Barring a untimely safety car for the Red Bull, things may have been different, but I think Verstappen had the edge almost all weekend over the Mercedes. And his teammate Sergio Perez jumped up from 4th to 3rd at the start, and that's where he finished. So I'm going to rate him as a 3. Ferrari, well, at one point I forgot the Ferraris were in this race, and they just kind of ran 5th and 6th and didn't really exist in the story of the race. I'm not really sure why they were so poor, but yeah, it's really disappointing, and it's kind of encapsulating again the story of the season. Last week in Austin they were at the front and then they fell away, and then this week they're nowhere, and that's kind of how the championship has been this season. So in terms of their ratings, Charles Leclerc went from 7th to 6th, a 2. And Carlos Sainz started 5th and he finished 5th. So a 2 for Carlos as well. Mercedes, they threatened to win the race for the second week in a row, but they didn't quite manage it. Lewis Hamilton starting 3rd, finishing 2nd, rate him a 3. George Russell went from second to fourth, but I'm going to still give him a 3 because his qualifying effort was superb. He was on par with Verstappen up until the final sector, where a mistake may or may not have cost him pole position, but he may have been within 0.2, a tenth of a second of the Red Bull come the end of the lap had he got it done tidily. Maybe even snatched the pole. Who knows? We might have had a very different race had that been the case. Alpine. Esteban Ocon went from 10th to 8th, a 2.5 for him. Fernando Alonso 9th, but failed to finish from that grid slot. Going to give him a 2.5 as well. He was driving a nice race up to that point. It made a mega start. It's just what Fernando does. He makes mega starts. He's one of those drivers. Lando Norris, he fell from 8th on the grid to 9th at the flag. A rating of 2 because he was fairly quiet this weekend. Not Lando's strongest weekend. But Daniel Ricciardo, 11th to 7th, while fighting a 10-second time penalty. That was the very best that he could have achieved, because he probably was never going to catch the Ferraris ahead. They're just out of reach of the midfield, really. So he won Formula 1.5, so a rating of 4 for Daniel Ricciardo. Let's move on to Alfa Romeo, where Valtteri Bottas was pretty much the start of qualifying. He qualified in 6th position, but he did fall to 10th place. However, that does end the Finns' barren run of points, which stretches all the way back to Canada, which was like round 8 of the season, and this was round 20. That's like 12 races with no points for the Porridge Man. But yeah, 2.5 for Bottas. Zhou Guanyu, his teammate, 12th back to 13th, a rating of 2. Sebastian Vettel and Aston Martin, 17th up to 14th. Lance Stroll started last after his grid drop for his collision with Fernando Alonso last week. Worked his way up to 15th. Was kind of unceremoniously shoved out of the way by Pierre Gasly. A rating of 2 for him as well as Sebastian. Ratings of 2s all round here to finish off. So Kevin Magnussen went from 15th to 17th. I think he had a grid penalty actually for new power unit, which I didn't factor in. Mick Schumacher 16th, finished 16th. Pierre Gasly 14th to 11th. Yuki Tsunoda failed to finish from 13th on the grid. Alex Albon started 18th, finished 12th. A good effort from him. Really nice drive in the Williams, which we know goes well down the straights. And Nicholas Latifi, he was at one point like 50 odd seconds behind the car in front of him. Yeah, really, really shocking that from Latifi. He didn't do anything wrong, he just wasn't very fast. So he finished 18th from 19th on the grid. Courtesy of just Tsunoda and Alonso failing to finish. Let's move on to our race rating. This race kind of under-delivered. It promised so much but gave us just so little. We were waiting for the strategy to play out, and it's one of those frustrating days where you feel like the story was left untold, or a potential story was left untold. It was devoid of just so much action, like almost everywhere. Really, we saw some overtaking, a lot of it just DRS moves, but at the front where it mattered most, didn't really have much of a fight. We had a little bit of a strategy game in the early stages, but once Verstappen was out in front, there was no catching him. Aside from Ricciardo's surge through the field, there wasn't much else to talk about really. We had Gasly shoving Stroll off the road, but that was a brief moment of excitement. I feel the final sector layout could really use some adjustments. I think that left-hand hairpin in the middle of it is just too tight. And the fact that the final corner onto the straight is just... it sets the cars too far apart. Yes, there's DRS, but they can close up there, and through the S's section, you want to do something about it, but then you have this concertina effect. It's just, it doesn't quite lend itself. Even with the 22 cars, it's just, not really that good, really. I think they could bank the final corner as well. That would be pretty cool. And so I always put the question of race rating to the ladies and gentlemen at the Grid Talk podcast. So Grid Talk host Ruby Price and Everything F1's Tom Downey gave the race a 5 out of 10. Pretty generous, I think, on that one. And fellow hosts Owen Medford and Louis Edwards gave the race a 3, as did Hit the Apex's Jawad Yacoub. F1 Chronicles Jared Partridge gave the race a 1 out of 10. For me, it's a 3 out of 10. Of course, you can leave your race rating in the comments down below. So that brings us to the end of the show. A shorter show than normal. Not really that much to talk about really in this race, so I can only work with what I'm given. So come on F1, pull out a couple of bangers to conclude the season. The checkered flag waves on another show. Thanks for joining me. Really hope you enjoyed it. You can find my written work at f1chronicle.com and insidef2.com, as well as more on this channel like my short videos reacting to breaking news or just general thoughts and opinion. If you like what I do, please leave a review, and if I rock the mic, give the show a like. Keep an eye out for more video content on YouTube, including my Ferrari F1 Manager Challenge. You can find more videos just over here. And until then, enjoy the racing, and I'll see you when the 5 red lights go out.